Hey everyone, it's Chuck McAfee with Berkshire Hathaway. I'm super excited to introduce you to Brian Douglas. Brian is one of my trusted real estate attorneys, as well as he does estate planning. And so it's a great resource for a lot of the questions that we get around the estate planning questions. So Brian, appreciate you doing this with me. And
yeah, I'm super excited. I love the conversation. I love talking about real estate, law, probate, anything weird you want to talk about.
Yeah,
I read too much. I think some people tell me I know enough about everything to be dangerous. So hopefully I know more than enough about this topic to share with you and your audience.
Awesome. We just wanted to go through a few questions that we do here in the marketplace. And so Brian's going to be a great resource for us. So kind of kicking right off. So what is this probate thing? What is probate and how do we kind of avoid it potentially?
So probate's just the legal process by which you take the assets of someone that's deceased and we transfer those, right? So if I own a home and I die, well, I'm not here to sign it anymore. I can't sell it because I'm not with us. So the property's kind of locked up, if you think of it kind of theoretically locked up, legally locked up. So probate is the legal process by which we go to court. We open the person's estate for the deceased, and then the court appoints someone that says, well, Brian's friend Chuck can be the executor of his estate. Now you have the power to sell my property. You have the power to dispose of my assets, to move the money around, to do whatever needs to be done. So it's tried and true. Probate, kind of everyone gets probate. There's nothing all that exciting about it because it's been around for not as long as time, but it's been around for a long, long time. You hit on something very interesting, which is why do we want to avoid it? And depending on who you ask, you may or may not want to. I'm a huge proponent of avoiding probate because it's a legal process that can be very cumbersome. It's very technical. If you don't know what you're doing, you can just get lost in the muck and the mire of the probate world and everything there. And then you take COVID, for example, and this stuff happens. Well, the court shut down.
Sure.
Well, when the court shut down, guess what? Business shuts down. So while you and I were still doing deals early on in COVID and things were still happening in the business world, anything that was in probate stopped until the courts reopened and felt that it was safe, and and it wasn't just a judge's decision, it's a government's decision, right? And so it really, really got complex, and probate's very much a period of starting and stopping, right? You do something, then you wait, then you do something, then you wait, and people get really frustrated because if someone wants to sell their house and we got to go through probate, they might be calling you today saying, hey, we really like to sell it, before the end of the year. And we're like, how about 6 months? And,
sure.
And then they look at you and they're like, oh my gosh, 6 months, it's going to take that long? And then they say, well, how do we shortcut it? And it's like, it's the government. There's no way to fast forward it. So probate, to the extent that you can avoid it, which is almost always, it should be avoided, but you've got to plan for it. You've got to do some stuff on the front.
So how do we avoid it then?
Well, you avoid it by making sure you don't have any probatable assets, which is an interesting topic because basically through the estate planning process, we would use trusts, either a trust or a series of trusts or maybe trusts and LLCs or something like that. We would put your assets into those various entities and then you don't own any assets anymore. So if I take all of Chuck's stuff and I put it into a trust, well, Chuck doesn't own it anymore. Now the trust owns it. So if something happens to Chuck, God forbid, we don't have any assets to take to probate court. So we just go over here and we look at the trust, and the trust is very well thought out, ideally. And then it says it has a whole succession plan built in. So if something happens to Chuck, we say next person up, so on and so forth down the line. And it's built so that it never fails. And there's always another mechanism by which your assets can be administered. And as long as there's always that succession line built into the trust, we don't have to go to probate.
Awesome. So you hit on kind of the next question I was kind of going to jump into. So what is the difference? Because a lot of people hear of the wills, and I have a will, but I don't think the trust topic is talked about as much. So for the audience, kind of what is the difference between a will and a trust?
So a will, there's a lot of different kinds of trusts, but we're going to talk about living trusts, I think is really probably the question you're asking. A will only helps you at one point in time. Do you know when that is?
I'm assuming
when you're dead.
When you die.
Right, but you're dead, so it's not really all that helpful to you anymore. And then the will is what? It's your ticket to probate court.
Gotcha.
Right? It's just a formal ticket. Now, if you die without a will and you don't have a trust and you don't have anything, you die what's called intestate. You're also going to probate court, but you're going to probate court not with a will that has your wishes laid out, but you're going to probate court with the laws of the great state of Georgia. So the legislature's already written out your will for you if you don't have any planning done.
Okay.
They've taken the liberty of doing that for you. The problem is you don't know what it says and you don't have any control over it. So at least get a will if you're going to go that route so you have some say in what's going to happen.
Okay.
But a will is just your final wishes. It's whatever you want to happen when you're dead, and that's what gets you to probate. A trust does that, but it does other things too, right? A trust is, the kind of trust, like I said, it's a living trust. So the significance of that is this while you're alive. So you can have a trust while you're alive that you use and you benefit from. Well, so you say, why do I need to benefit from it while I'm alive? Because I'm alive and I can take care of everything just like I could with a will. True. But here's the deal. What happens if you become incapacitated, right? Because we talked about being alive and we talked about being dead. Well, there's this middle section of I'm alive, but I'm not well. I can't take care of my own affairs. The trust already covers that as well. So the trust has this continuity, if you will, right? While you're alive and well, if you're alive and not well, and then your legacy considerations, whatever that is. Whereas a will, as long as you're alive by artificial means or otherwise, and you're still breathing, that will doesn't do anything for you. And so that's really the big difference. Okay. Fundamentally, they do the same thing, which is when people think about a will versus a trust, it's disposing of your assets in certain circumstances. With a will, it's only when you're deceased. With a trust, alive and well, alive but not well, and deceased.
Okay. I think some of the trust, kind of from what I hear, and even some of my friends, I think, kind of have this perception that trusts are just for wealthy people.
Yeah.
Just provide a little bit of insight, maybe, and kind of defeat that myth potentially out there. Kind of give it some insight if you don't mind.
Yeah. And that's funny because people always, I'll have conversations like this with someone, or they'll call this up an estate planning conversation. They're like, well, I've heard about trust, but how much money do you need to have it? And where does it make sense? And it always makes me chuckle a little bit, not the question, but kind of the subject matter, because I don't actually care how much money you have when it comes to setting up a trust. Now, if you have tens of millions of dollars or more, we need to talk about trust planning for all sorts of other reasons that have to do with the tax code and complicated things like that. But for what I would call, quote unquote, normal people, the regular people among us, which is most of us, trusts are still really, really valuable because they accomplish those various things, right? It doesn't matter if you only have $500,000 in assets. Like I have a couple right now, they're in their 70s. It's a second marriage for both of them. And they called me. They found me online or something like that. They called me and I had this consultation with them. And they own a $300,000 condominium, here in Cobb County, right?
Sure.
It's a joint asset, but it's second marriages for both. So they're both long since retired from Bell South, second marriages, children from prior marriages. They don't have a lot of assets on paper. And he even said that. He said, Brian, I only have one thing. It's this house. He's like, but I know that if something happens to one of us today, it's going to be a mess with the blended family.
Sure.
And he said, how can we fix this so that we don't have a problem? And I said, well, what do you want? He said, I want it so that if one of us passes away, the other one can live here until they pass away. When the second one passes away, it goes to the kids. And I want it super easy and to avoid probate. Super easy generally means I don't want to go to court and deal with all that,
Sure.
And I said, well, you need a trust. And he said, let's do it. And they were so happy, even though they didn't have millions and millions of dollars in business holdings and all these complex things. They were so happy because it accomplished their goals and exactly what they wanted, which is, I don't want my kids, I don't want my stepkids, I don't want my family fighting, I don't want my kids fighting with my wife,
Sure.
And so yeah, there's no real requirement of any amount of assets. The more you have, the bigger the argument is for a trust. Again, from complexity standpoint, taxes, efficiencies, things of that nature. The other time that a trust makes a tremendous amount of sense, it's almost a no-brainer, is if you have little kids, right? And the doomsday event happens.
Sure.
And the doomsday event is, the Titanic sinks, right? My wife and I go on the Love Boat and the thing crashes. Well, I've got 3 little girls, that. And it's like, what happens if something just happened to me and my wife was okay? That's one thing, right? Because we can deal with that and she'll get the money and hopefully everything will be all right, and vice versa. But if something happens to both of us, now we've got these little kids that are looking to inherit life insurance money and 401ks and real estate, or whatever it is you have. And even if it's only $500,000 or $200,000 or whatever it is, you can pick a number that's like, oh, it's not that much money. It is that much money if it's going to a 5-year-old.
Sure.
Because the law doesn't allow a 5-year-old to have $200,000. So then you've got to go through this other probate process. On top of the estate probate process, you got to do this other stuff because kids are incompetent by law, and it just gets so complex over and over again. So if you've got minor kids and you work and have a 401k from your job, life insurance, things like that, even real estate, whatever it is, it's almost a no-brainer to have a trust, just so that that legacy side, that third bucket, it's all planned out for them so that we don't have to deal with the probate courts and all that, because it's a big mess.
No, and I could speak personally. I mean, obviously that was one of the main reasons I personally asked Brian to help us in our estate planning side of it, and then creating that trust was for the kiddos.
Yeah.
I mean that was a big portion, and you guys were awesome on doing all that. So, real quick, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see when it comes to kind of the estate planning side of the house?
So the biggest mistakes, number one is not doing anything, right? I mean, just people I can do it tomorrow. I joke, I've got a client, she's a real estate agent, ironically, and we've been friends for, 15 years probably. And I started her estate plan. She adopted a son, and I think he's probably 8 now, 9.
Okay.
And we started this when he was like 1. And I always joke that I'm like, people would rather go to the dentist than they would to come see me for this. And I made that joke to her. She's like, we're gonna finish this. And I'm like, how long has this been going on? And I said that. I'm like, listen, I get it. People would rather go to the dentist than that. And she laughed. She said, you're right. She said, because it's been 6 years and I've gone, twice a year. I'm like, exactly. Yeah. But you haven't found the time to do this. And there's this mindset, and that's the not doing anything, right? There's this mindset of, well, I can do it tomorrow. New Year's comes around, it ends up on everyone's resolution list, and then other things come up. And so yeah, just not having a plan is, because it's a mess at that point, trying to figure it all out. Where does it go? Who's fighting with whom? Like, money, as I've found, and you might have experienced this, does bring out the best in people and the worst in people, right? You just never know which one. Now, unfortunately, in my role, I only get the calls from the worst, right?
Sure.
No one ever calls me and says, Brian, my great uncle left me $10 million. I don't know what to do with it, kind of thing. But it's, hey, my sister's doing this, or my dad's doing this, or my stepmom, or blah, blah, blah. So that's number one. And number two is, you don't know what you don't know, right? And this is true for all of us in anything.
Sure. So
when people get on the Google and all the stuff, and they want to do it, and that's all fine. Like, I don't know anything. I'm not that brilliant. It's like only I can do it. I just know what I know, and I have a specialized skill set, as we all do in our respective professions. So with estate planning, the problem with some of the DIY that you really run into that I see, and even like the LegalZooms, some of those services that help you, the big problem I see is nobody looks at them until it's too late. Right? Someone will come in and we'll be in the middle of a closing, and I'll say, what's going on with grandma? And they'll show up at the table. I mean, like, literally, they signed a contract, someone signed a contract, they signed grandma's name to it, or they do whatever. And I'm like, well, where's grandma? Because I don't see anyone that looks like grandma. And they're like, oh no, she's in a nursing home over in Loganville. I'm like, oh, okay, well, do we have a power of attorney? And when you try to ask this ahead of time and avoid that situation, of course, but every once in a while we get to that point or whatever, regardless of when we get there, they say, oh yeah, here, well, send it to me. And I look at it and I'm like, ooh, sorry, this isn't good enough. And it's, what do you mean? I found it online and I printed it off, and I put grandma's name here, and then she signed it and we had it notarized. I'm like, it's not that easy, right? So once it's with estate planning, once it's too late, right? We can do anything ahead of time on the planning side, but once grandma gets to that point, once grandma passes away, things are set in stone, and there's no way to fix that. And then our only choice is what? Go to court. Gets super expensive, and it takes a long time. So yeah, it's that acknowledging or understanding you don't know what you don't know, and the devil's in the details, right? You miss one little paragraph, or you add one line in that's wrong, you can invalidate an entire document. And if grandma's got Alzheimer's, she can't sign a new one. So we got to throw it all out and start over.
No, and I can speak to that personally. We had some, unfortunately, a loss in the family, and individual thought that they had a rock solid will, and it was not.
Yeah.
It's really not an enforceable will, and they're going through some challenges right now.
Yeah.
And it's not a pretty situation, unfortunately. So they thought they were doing a good thing, kind of DIYing it, and it's going actually the opposite way, and it's getting kind of ugly. So no, great information. There's a lot, as you can imagine, involved in this process. I am by no means an expert. That is why Brian is here. So if you have questions about trusts, wills, estate planning, reach out to us. Let us know how we can help. We will get you in touch with Brian and his firm. They're rock solid at what they do in this. And thank you as always, and I hope you guys have a great one.